Hey there, greetings everyone. GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we finished everything in the Reign of Chaos portion of our journey. We are now starting the last leg, which is the Frozen Throne, Warcraft 3, the Frozen Throne, and the surrounding lore. And then we'll actually be onto World of Warcraft and its lore. The Frozen Throne is probably the lightest, even though it's got some really cool lore and some important things. It's really going to be the lightest in terms of contributing to the overall narrative of World of Warcraft. So we have basically three beats that are going to happen. We have the Illidan's time in the Broken Shores, and his kind of like allying with the Naga race and the Watchers coming after them. Now, establishing the Broken Shores is important for much later content for Legion, and the explanation of why there are Naga so prevalent, why they're on the Outland, why the Blood Elves are on the Outland. All of that helps us set up for a little bit down the line. None of it's really immediately useful in the future, other than why Naga are around. The second act, we'll talk about the Blood Elves. So that's probably the most important thing, is that we're establishing the Blood Elves, one of the main races. And that one also goes further into explaining why the Blood Elves are part of the Horde, and why they are, as opposed to the Alliance, why they're not part of the Alliance, really, I guess, and by default, then they become part of the Horde, and why they're in the Outland. And then finally, there's an undead campaign, which really sees the rise of the Forsaken. So we do have a couple of the races, two of the Horde races, that become important. We get to find out why the Horde Forsaken joined the Horde, and how Sylvanas becomes their leader, and what the current state of the Forsaken lands and how they are. So all of those important beats, but not so. We also see the Lich King, Arthas becoming the Lich King. So that's also important as well. So it sets up a lot of things that don't necessarily get touched on in Classic, but that are important for the Burning Crusade, for Wrath of the Lich King, and ultimately even for Legion. Finally, there is a bonus campaign that starts us off. Really, you could consider it almost World of Warcraft material, because it's not the same style of game. And it gets us into the founding of Durotar and Orgrimmar, which is very important for setting up World of Warcraft proper. All right, where we are going to start, though, is this is, and again, I've that Akariat X, I laud him, and I've actually gotten a little bit lazy, because what he does is so time consuming. So that I've kind of just defaulted, and now you just using that person's list. I say his, I don't know what they are. But unfortunately, there are some little discrepancies. So for the sake of the argument, or for the sake of like whatever, this last chunk of the Arthas book, part 3 here, a lot of it takes place in the Frozen Throne, but actually a lot of it should have been covered already. Where we left off, it just picks right up where it left off in the last chapter, which was a while back, but it's really covering kind of the end of the campaign of Reign of Chaos. So we're going to make up a few chapters that we really, if I ever go back and curate this show and create like a master true chronological list, which is something that will keep me busy in the far future, because eventually, we would hypothetically run out of content. But there are little projects like that in the back of my mind where I feel like this can be tightened up and made even better. And this part, the first sections of it, we should have already covered. So we'll catch ourselves up to speed with a retelling of what Arthas has done, and then we'll pick up and kind of just make our way up to setting the table for what's going to happen. So even though the final campaign is the undead campaign, the a lot of what we're about to read is, again, setting the table for that campaign, even though then we're immediately going to take a hard pivot and start talking about what Illidan is doing in the Blood Elves and stuff like that. All right, so part 3, this is the final part of Arthas. It's called The Dark Lady. Stay a while and listen to this little mini interlude. I probably have talked for as long as I'm about to read. Sylvanas Windrunner, former Ranger General of Quel'Thalas, Banshee, and Dark Lady of the Forsaken, strode from the royal quarters with the same quick, lithe stride she had had in life. She preferred her corporeal form for ordinary everyday activities. Her leather boots made no sound on the stone floor of the Undercity, but all heads turned to watch their lady. She was unique and unmistakable. So I think it's interesting that she can now go from Banshee form to corporeal form. This is obviously the future because we have an Undercity. So that even though this is an interlude, I think we're going to kind of jump back in time. So it's not chronological. Once her hair had been golden, her eyes blue, her skin the color of a fresh peach. Once she had been alive. Now her hair, often covered by a blue-black cowl, was black as midnight with white streaks, and her formerly peach-hued skin a faint, pearly blue-gray. She had chosen to don the armor she had worn in life, well-tooled leather that revealed most of her slender but muscular torso. Her ears twitched at the murmurings. She did not often venture forth from her chambers. She was ruler of this city, and the world came to her. Beside her hurried Master Apothecary Farinell, head of the Royal Apothecary Society, who was talking animatedly and simpering. "I am most grateful you agreed to come, my lady," she said, trying to bow and walk at the same time. "You did say you wished to be informed when the experiments were successful, and you wanted to see them yourself, once we—" "I am well aware of my own orders, Doctor," Sylvanas snapped as they began to descend a winding corridor into the bowels of the Undercity. What's also interesting is that, remember, this is a Christie Golden book, and as we've been reading, she also spent a whole writing a whole novel on Sylvanas. So to see this earlier thing and how she's going to kind of weave what she previously wrote into that novel as well. We'll do a little of that coming up real soon. Of course, here we are." They emerged into a room that, to one with weaker sensibilities, would seem like a house of horrors. On a large table, a stooped undead was busily sewing together pieces of different corpses, humming a little under his breath. Sylvanas smiled slightly. "It is good to see someone who enjoys his work so," she replied a trifle archly. The apprentice started slightly and then bowed deeply. There was a low buzz of some kind of energy crackling. Other alchemists bustled about, mixing potions, weighing ingredients, jotting notes. The smell was a combination of putrefaction, chemicals, and incongruously, the clean, sweet smell of certain herbs. Sylvanas was startled by her reaction. The scent of the herbs made her oddly homesick. Fortunately, the softer emotion did not last long. Such emotions never did. "Show me," she demanded. Farinell bowed and ushered her through the main area, past pieces of bodies hanging on hooks, into a side room. The faint sound of sobbing reached her ears. As she entered, Sylvanas saw several cages on the floor, or swinging slowly from chains, all of them filled with test subjects. Some were human, some were forsaken. All were dull-eyed with fear that had pierced so deep and had gone on so long that they were almost numb. They would not be so for much longer. "As you can imagine, my lady," Farinell was saying, "it is difficult to transport Scourge as test subjects. Of course, for experimental purposes, Forsaken are identical to Scourge. But I am delighted to report that our tests in the field have been well documented and quite successful." Excitement began to stir in Sylvanas, and she graced the apothecary with a rare and still beautiful smile. "That pleases me greatly," she said. The undead doctor fairly quivered in delight. He beckoned to his assistant Keever, a Forsaken whose brain had obviously been damaged by his first death and who muttered to himself in the third person as he removed 2 test subjects. One was a human woman, who was apparently not so lost in fear and despair as not to start weeping silently whenever Kiever dragged her from her cage. The Forsaken male, however, was utterly impassive and stood quietly. Sylvanas eyed him. Criminal. Of course, my lady. She wondered if it were true, but in the end it didn't matter. He would serve the Forsaken even so. The human girl was on her knees. Kiever stooped down, yanked her head up by her hair, and when she opened her mouth to cry out in pain, he poured a cup of something down her throat and covered her mouth, forcing her to swallow. Sylvanas watched while she struggled. Beside her, the Forsaken male accepted the cup that Farinell offered without protest, draining it dry. It happened quickly. The human girl soon stopped struggling, her body tensing, and then going into paroxysms. Kiever let her go, watching almost curiously as blood began to stream from her mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. Sylvanas turned her gaze to the Forsaken. He still regarded her steadily, silently. She began to frown. Perhaps this is not as effective as your... The Forsaken shuddered. He struggled to stand erect for a moment longer, but his rapidly weakening body betrayed him, and he stumbled, falling hard. Everyone stepped back. Sylvanas watched raptly, her lips parted in excitement. The same strain? She asked Farinell. The human female whimpered once and then was still, her eyes open. The alchemist nodded happily. Indeed it is, he said. As you can imagine, we are quite... The undead spasmed, his skin breaking open in spots and weeping black ichor, and then he too was still. Pleased with the results. Indeed, Sylvanas said. She was hard put to conceal her own elation. Pleased was a pale word indeed. A plague that kills both humans and scourge, and obviously affects my own people as well, as they too are undead. She gave him a look from glowing silver eyes. We must take care that this never falls into the wrong hands. The results could be devastating. He gulped. Indeed, my lady. Indeed they could. She forced a neutral expression as she returned to the royal quarters. Her mind was racing with 1,000 things, but foremost among them, burning as brightly and wildly as the wicker man she lit every Hallows End, was a single thought. At last, Arthas, will pay for what you have done. The humans who spawn such as you shall be slaughtered. Your scourge shall be stopped in their tracks. You will no longer be able to hide behind your armies of mindless undead puppets, and we will grace you with the same mercy and compassion you showed us. Despite her great control, she found herself smiling. So that could be referencing things that's going to happen in Frozen Throne, but I'm more inclined to think that's the scene at the Wrath Gate in Wrath of the Lich King. When she finally brings the fight up, if you remember, anybody that's played that part, there's that cutscene where they basically unleash this plague that kills everything. There's also a plague that gets unleashed. I'm trying to remember. It's like an instance thing. Maybe it's BFA. Maybe it's Legion. I don't remember, but there's an instance that you can do where they go into the Undercity and you rescue one of the Orcish lieutenants, maybe Atrek, I can't remember. All right, so we've got that. We'll read a little bit more Arthas because now we've actually got to start catching up. But for now, this episode is in the pipe, 5x5. I thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see everyone next time on Lore of Warcraft.